Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up. We're about to embark on a high-speed chase through over 2,000 years of British history. It's a story full of invasions, intrigue, and a lot of very determined people with equally determined hairdos. We'll meet Roman emperors, Viking raiders, rebellious monarchs, and more than a few people who got a little too carried away with power. So sit back, relax, and let's hop in the time machine to discover how this island became the United Kingdom we know today. Our story begins with the Romans, who considered Britain a mythical land sort of like Atlantis, but with more fog. That changed in 55 BC when Julius Caesar decided he needed a new island to conquer. Unfortunately for him, the Britons were not keen on becoming Roman subjects, so he had to settle for some awkward beach photos and head back home. Nearly a century later, Emperor Claudius had another go, and unlike Caesar, he actually stuck around, establishing Roman rule in Britain. Londinium, that's London to us, was born, complete with Roman baths, roads, and the British obsession with central heating. The Romans even took a liking to Stonehenge, although they couldn't quite figure out what to do with it. Maybe they thought it was an ancient game of rock, paper, scissors. But alas, even the mighty Romans couldn't last forever. By the early 5th century, Rome had bigger problems back home, so they packed up their togas and left, leaving Britain to fend for itself. With the Romans gone, the Anglo-Saxons moved in, bringing with them some fantastic names like Athward the Unready, who, shockingly, was never really ready for anything. These tribes established their own kingdoms, and Britain entered what we fondly call the Dark Ages. Not because it was gloomy, although let's be honest, it probably was, but because historical records are a bit sketchy. Just when the Anglo-Saxons were getting comfortable, along came the Vikings. Now, these weren't the horn helmet wearing warriors you see in movies. Those helmets are a myth. But they were definitely into raiding, pillaging, and setting up shop wherever they landed. In 793, they made their grand entrance by attacking a monastery at Lindisfarne, and from there it was game on. The Vikings carved out their own territories, with York becoming a major Viking stronghold. The Anglo-Saxons weren't too happy about this, so they decided to fight back. Enter Alfred the Great, the king who wasn't just great at ruling but also at burning cakes, though that's probably not on his official resume. In 1066, the Viking era came to a dramatic end at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold Godwinson defeated Harold Hardrada. But before Harold could even catch his breath, another Harold, okay? It was actually William the Conqueror showed up from Normandy, changing the course of British history forever. William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and with it, the English throne. He wasted no time in building castles because, let's face it, who doesn't love a good castle, and implementing the feudal system, which was basically a medieval pyramid scheme where peasants did all the work, and the nobles collected all the rewards. The Normans brought with them French language, culture, and a flair for fashion that even the Anglo-Saxons couldn't resist. The famous Tower of London was built during this time, a place that's seen more bloodshed, intrigue than a season finale Game of Thrones. Skipping ahead, we come to the Plantagenets, a dynasty that gave us the Magna Carta in 1215. This was essentially a medieval complaint letter from the nobles to King John, who by all accounts was not the best at sharing power. The Magna Carta was a big deal because it laid the groundwork for constitutional law, and the idea that even kings couldn't just do whatever they pleased, though many would still try. The medieval period was also home to the 100 Years' War, which, despite the name, lasted 116 years, but who's counting? This was a family feud between England and France that involved a lot of battles, shifting alliances, and Joan of Arc, who wasn't keen on England sticking around in France. Then, just when everyone thought things couldn't get worse, along came the War of the Roses, a civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. It was like a Shakespearean drama, except with real blood and no intermission. The conflict ended in 1485 when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, starting the Tudor dynasty and giving us one of history's most infamous families. The Tudors were a colorful bunch, none more so than Henry VIII, who is probably best known for his 6 wives and his talent for starting new churches. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry decided to create the Church of England, making him the head honcho of both the state and the church. He also dissolved the monasteries and took their wealth, which made him pretty unpopular with the monks but very popular with the monks. After Henry's death, his children took turns on the throne, with varying degrees of success. Edward VI was king for a short time before dying young, leaving his half-sisters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, to sort out the mess. Mary, known as Bloody Mary, tried to bring England back to Catholicism with fire and brimstone, literally. She burned over 300 Protestants at the stake, which didn't exactly win hearts and minds. Elizabeth I, on the other hand, brought stability and a golden age of exploration, culture, and most importantly, Shakespeare. Under her reign, England defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, thanks in part to some bad weather that England took full credit for. The Tudors were followed by the Stuarts, who had a bit of a rocky relationship with Parliament. Things came to a head with Charles I, who believed in the divine right of kings, a fancy way of saying, I can do whatever I want. Parliament disagreed, leading to the English Civil War. Spoiler alert, Charles lost his head over it, literally. After a brief experiment with a republic under Oliver Cromwell, who wasn't exactly a bundle of joy, the monarchy was restored with Charles II, who was known for his love of parties, mistresses, and generally undoing everything Cromwell did. The Stuarts ended with Queen Anne, who oversaw the Acts of Union in 1707, creating Great Britain by uniting England and Scotland. They also introduced the practice of constitutional monarchy, a fancy term for the monarch is in charge, but Parliament actually does the work. With the Hanoverian kings came the Georgian era, which was all about elegance, enlightenment, and empire building. Britain was growing richer and more powerful, thanks to trade, industry, and a few questionable overseas adventures. The 18th century saw the rise of the British Empire, with territories stretching from the Americas to India. But it wasn't all tea and crumpets. The American colonies decided they'd had enough of British taxes without representation, leading to the Revolutionary War. King George III didn't take it well, but after a few rounds of "we're not paying your taxes anymore," he had to accept that America was out of the empire. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Factories were popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and steam engines were changing the way people worked and lived. Cities grew rapidly, and with them, the problems of urbanization like pollution, overcrowding, and a general sense of what have we done. Enter the Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria, who ruled for a whopping 63 years. Under her reign, the British Empire reached its zenith, with the famous saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." It was a time of great progress, with innovations in science, technology, and culture. Charles Darwin published on the origin of species, while Dickens wrote about the hardships of the poor, and the world was introduced to Sherlock Holmes. The Industrial Revolution continued to transform society, with railways, telegraphs, and factories reshaping the landscape. But the Victorian era wasn't just about progress, it was also about strict social codes, moral uprightness, and a fascination with death. Victorians loved a good funeral, and mourning attire was practically a fashion statement. Despite the grandeur of the empire, the Victorian period wasn't all roses. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s caused mass starvation and emigration, while the working conditions in factories and mines were often horrendous. But the British were nothing if not resilient, and social reforms gradually improved conditions for the working class. With the dawn of the 20th century, Britain was a global superpower, but the storm clouds of war were gathering. World War I, 1914 to 1918, was a brutal conflict that left millions dead and shattered the old world order. The war also marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire, as colonies began to push for independence. The interwar years were a time of economic hardship and political instability, leading to the rise of fascism in Europe. In 1939, Britain found itself at war again, this time against Nazi Germany. World War II was even more devastating than the first, but Britain, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, played a crucial role in the Allied victory. After the war, Britain was exhausted both economically and socially. The empire began to unravel, with India gaining independence in 1947, and other colonies following suit. At home, the Labour government established the National Health Service (NHS) and the welfare state, which transformed British society. The post-war years were marked by the Cold War, decolonization, and the rise of a new generation. The 1960s brought cultural revolution, with the Beatles, swinging London, and a whole lot of questionable fashion choices. Britain also joined the European Economic Community, which would later become the European Union, a relationship that would prove to be as rocky as any royal marriage. In recent years, Britain has continued to evolve. The 21st century has seen the UK navigate financial crises, wars in the Middle East, and the divisive Brexit vote, which saw the country leave the European Union in 2020. And in 2022, the country bid farewell to Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, marking the end of an era.